To see everybody this morning. Got a good crowd for Bible study. Glad everybody's here. It was a little bit late before class, but I did put out a new sheet for next week's study. So if you didn't get a copy of that after class, if you want to grab it or if you want to grab it now, that will get us from verses 12 through 18 in James chapter 1. Today we are studying the very first lesson. And if you don't have a copy of those notes, there's extra copies on the back table of lesson number 1, which deals with the way that we as Christians look at and handle trials. So it's lesson number 1, Christian response to trials. And that's going to be part 1, James 1, verses 1 through 11. James 1, verses 1 through 11. All right, so first of all, let's read the first 11 verses, and then we're going to go back and we have 3 or 4 discussion questions. We're going to try to get into those, and all the James notes should be on just the table back here if you need the James notes. Yeah, the introduction and the first page, they're all on the small wooden table in the back. So there's one page, all the pages have like the text, and then on the back of it we'll have discussion questions. And so the discussion questions for each of the lessons will be on the back. So lesson number 1. All right, so let me begin. We'll read it, and then we'll go back and open up for our discussion questions. Let's start in verse 1. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, and driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field he will pass away. For no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat than it withers the grass. Its flower falls, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits. Okay. What we like to do and what we have done historically is we use the discussion questions to kind of guide us through the text, but it also hopefully helps us open up for some of your thoughts on what you've been reflecting on throughout the week. So here's question number 1. This deals with the first 2-3 verses of the text. James tells us to rejoice in trials. Is that our normal response to difficulties? And why do you think that we so often fail to see trials as a good thing? Right? What are your thoughts on that? Any thoughts on trials? It does bring out the best in us. Is that the way we normally think of trials, though? When trials happen, do we go, this is a great thing happening to us? Joel?
We want instant gratification.
We do?
Instant recognition of our. So
Yeah.
I don't want to feel bad right now. I don't look forward to the future.
Right?
You know, I'm talking about culturally.
Right?
I'm sure Paul did not appreciate his stone, beaten, whipped, shipwrecked, and all this, but he had a future vision, which carried. Sometimes I wonder if we've got that future vision.
Yeah, I think there's, and he'll talk about wisdom in a minute. Wisdom is kind of it's not infallible, right? It's not infallible foresight, but wisdom is the ability to kind of look ahead and see what consequences of actions are going to be. And that's not a miraculous thing. It's just the ability to do that. If I have 2 and 2, it's going to equal 4. And I think what you're saying, Joel, is exactly true. Sometimes we don't do that. We don't look to the end of things. But I mean, typically, if we're honest in this room, when bad things happen, probably none of us go, this is great. This is a really good thing happening to us, because our feeling is, let's get this off of us as quickly as we can possibly get us off us. We typically view trials as a really bad thing to happen to us, and we try to maneuver our way around it as quickly as possible. Why is that? Joel's given one idea. Any other ideas on why we don't see them as good things as often as we do? Yeah, Gloria.
In reality, when you're hurting, it's really hard
Sure.
to see any good
Yeah.
that can come out of it.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be real, that's life.
Yeah, it is. So you go through a tough time, and I think, from an emotional perspective, it just seems like the world grows dark, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel and no hand to hold. It just seems like it's an obstacle that's hard to overcome, and it's hard to look beyond that sometimes, Art.
But at the same time, don't we all learn from mistakes that we made? Even things
Oh, yeah.
that we've been hurt. Your girls fall down and skin their knee.
Sure.
They learn something.
Yeah, they do.
The next time, they're not going to do that. And the next time, I don't know what we all get into things like that,
I agree.
and that injury teaches us something.
I think so, and I think that's part of the formula that James has. I think you're right on the mark there, where he talks about it producing patience, and the idea is you've got to go through it, but you come out better for it on the other side. It's just tough to go through it because we just want it to stop because it's so miserable, whatever it is that we're going through. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, a couple things. Yeah, Tommy, go ahead.
Well, part of our makeup is emotions.
It is.
And a lot of times, according to the degree of the trial, depends upon how, our emotions depend upon that and how involved we get. And sometimes it's just hard to back off and
It
go,
is.
well, I'll come through this okay and I'll be better for it. But a lot of times that is clouded by the situation.
It is, yeah. I think, and if you didn't hear Tommy, he brought out the fact that we're all built with emotion. All of us are. Some people, I guess, situationally, it depends how we handle our emotions. Some people handle their emotions in some situations better than others do. And then on the flip side, others don't handle their emotions as well in other situations as other people do. But that's part of who we are. It's part of how God made us. And so not only are we intellectual beings, but we're also deeply emotional people. And so when you're going through something, when I'm going through something, and the emotion kicks in, it's hard to put the pieces of the puzzle together from an intellectual standpoint when the emotion kicks in. And I guess depending on how personal it is, how it kind of determines how emotional it can be. And when you're in the throes of emotion, it's hard sometimes to see any good coming out of that. Yeah, Terry?
Well, during one of the darkest periods of this country, World War II,
Yeah,
prior to that, it's amazing how unprepared
yeah,
this country was for war. We had trucks going around acting like tanks. We had
right.
machine guns that was non-existent. All of what we needed, we didn't have.
Right.
We rose to the occasion.
Yeah, and that's a
Conditions, I mean, it's just unbelievable.
and it's a good example to say a lack of preparedness leaves you kind of exposed whenever the actual trial comes. I think that's a good illustration to show that even spiritually, what James is doing is trying to prepare us for these events, and when they do happen, if we're not prepared, then I kind of think we end up where Tommy was talking about. We just end up trying to emotionally treat these situations, and we don't really fare well when we're just emotionally going through these situations. There has to be some knowledge and some wisdom that goes into it as well. All right, so let's take a look at a couple words. Yeah, Paula, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, a lot of times it depends on what a person's going through too, at the time that another issue could come up.
Yeah.
It could be like a buildup of different.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think this, everybody's kind of said it in their own way. I think different situations hit people differently. You go through a trial, and some people absolutely have turtle shells, right? And you can throw an insult at a person like that, and it just bounces right off, and it doesn't bother them at all. Another person, they just shut down over that, and they just can't handle that. Somebody could go through a separation from a friend or maybe the death of a loved one and handle it a whole lot better than another person can do that. So I just think all of us are built differently, and we respond to different stimuli differently. And but James is telling us, regardless of what it is, because he has, he talks about various trials, all the kinds of trials we go through. So he's talking about, in general, all of them. There's a way to handle that. So here's a couple things. Notice, Carol didn't mean to take.
David, would you say there's a such thing as over-caring?
Sure.
Over-caring
Yeah,
brings on the emotion side.
yeah, yeah.
I don't think there's a such thing as over-caring.
Right.
I think some care more than others.
Well, probably what happens in a situation like that, because some people are built this way, and to some degree, I want people. It matters how people think about me. To me, it does. And when people don't think about me very well, it bothers me. It just destroys me. I'll lose sleep over that. And I think when you invest in somebody and they don't reciprocate that, it just, that's just built into that's my personality type. I'm just, and so other people, it doesn't affect them at all because they just don't care. It's just like I can move on. And I don't mean like being apathetic. I just mean, if they try to do something nice for somebody and they don't reciprocate that, then they just move on. And other people, they get stuck right there. Art?
But one of the things that James is teaching us here, I believe, is that we can learn
Yes.
to get over. and
That's
get
exactly
past
right.
things.
Whatever it is, I agree with you 100%.
There are ways to do that.
Yeah, totally 100%. Okay, so in verses 1 and 2, or really verse 1, we kind of dealt with that last week. We talked about some of the introductory things. We identified James. We kind of identified who we believe are meant by the 12 tribes scattered abroad. So we dealt with that introductory thing last week. There's a word in verse 2 where he starts that I think is really important, that sometimes gets skipped over to try to get to the meatier part of that verse. And there's this simple word that appears right at the beginning of verse 2, and it's the word brethren. And that's really important for what he's about to say when it comes to trials. And when he says brethren, what's he talking about here?
Fellow Christians.
Yes. It's about the church, all right? So there's this relationship that exists within the church that doesn't exist with anybody outside of that. It's a spiritual relationship. And there's some implications involved when he says, my brethren, okay? So one, it proves he considers them to be equals. He's not better than them. They're not better than him. They're just on the same playing field, right? They're fellow workers. In chapter 2, we're going to find how it's going to prevent some class distinctions in the church, where he addresses the issue of favoritism. Right? They were just showing partiality, and James said you can't do that as a Christian. But I think it also shows the importance of every member, and it enjoins upon us the highest responsibilities because we have responsibilities toward each other, which in the end really glorifies the power of Jesus' work, because it's the Lord who made everybody equal in him. But there's some real practical reasons to those next words with what he says. He's about to show how things sometimes can be really hard in life. And by calling them brothers, he is showing not only his deep concern for them, but he's showing that, if you use tender terms of affection, you can make things more palatable, and he's certainly doing that. But he's putting himself in the shoes of the audience, which is to say, I've gone through the same things you've gone through. I know what it's like to struggle just like you struggle. And so his first admonition is, count it all joy, which may be the hardest part of the whole thing, because that's not our typical response to trials. The word joy here means the fullest joy, right? This is the kind of joy that is happiness. You should be happy when these things befall you. It doesn't mean that you're taking what's happening lightly, right? That you're sort of dismissive of the situation, but it does mean that we're happy because these things happen to us. And when he says count, it means that we're placing value upon this. So we consider these things to be very valuable to our growth. And our typical way to read this would be count it all tragedy, and yet joy is what's commanded of us. And the point is that as a Christian, right, we could say this generically with everything, as a Christian, are we required to view things differently than the world would typically view it? And our understanding of trials, this gets what Art was talking about a moment ago and Joel earlier, our view of trials is different because we are brethren, because we are servants of God. So the way we see it should be different. Now, he does mention here various trials at the end of verse 2, meaning that there's many different kinds. And we're going to distinguish next week, right, when we get to verse 12. When he talks about in verse 12 and 13, when he says, let no man say when he's tempted, I'm tempted of God, these are two different types of trials here. The ones to sin are mentioned in verses 12 and following. These are not the trials that cause people to sin, although they could based on our response to it. These are not orchestrated to be, the kind of things that would be a lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, or pride of life. This is kind of the general adversities or afflictions of life. And I do think it's interesting, the wording here. I don't know if this means any, I'm not trying to make more of it than what's there. But I do think in verse 2 when he says, I don't know if you saw this week, he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into these things." What does that suggest? Steve, go ahead. I didn't mean to take something away from you.
Well, I understand it to be Jewish Christians, those that came from, that are scattered abroad,
Sure.
And they're among Gentiles.
Sure.
So they're among people that don't really know what Jews have gone through and
Yeah.
they become Christians.
Yeah.
And I say it's more difficult for them than
Oh, yeah.
where like today, the church is being, Christians are being turned against.
Sure. The culture of our world, yeah.
Yeah, our world.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Joel?
I would, just a thought occurred, why are they being tried anyway?
Sure.
Because they're Christians.
That's right.
If they wasn't Christians,
Yeah.
they'd be left alone. They wouldn't
Yeah.
bother, they're fine. But they're being tried because of their brethren, so they can look ahead and say, okay, I can count this as joy because I'm a Christian, and that's why
That's it.
I'm
Yeah.
being tried.
Yeah, that's it. It's hard for us to understand in an affluent society because we've never really been challenged the way they were in the first century. How you can just be completely cut off, and they were in the first century. To become a Christian, essentially, especially like Steve said, when you're in a Jewish community and you become a Christian, nobody does business with you anymore, and your business just shuts down, and you can't buy from merchants because they don't want to sell to you anymore, and all of a sudden you're strapped for necessities of life. I mean, there's challenges that we've not ever really experienced. It may get that way at some point because it seems like the world is kind of caving in on Christianity. I don't know, but it's hard to imagine the kind of difficulties they were faced with. He does say that these are things they fall into, right? Does this seem like it's more external or more internal that he's talking about here? Yeah, it seems more external, right? These are things that it's not like we are producing these things and trying to do it. It's like he talks about in verse 13, like these things, the lust in the mind and how we're deceived and drawn away. This seems like more external things that are beyond us. We didn't create them, but they're just out there, and these are things that we have to deal with. So now that brings us to number 2 in our questions. What is the result of trials according to Jesus? And this is how we get to the point where we can say it's a good thing to have gone through this. In what way do trials perfect patience? How does patience bring us to the point where we lack nothing? And do you think this depends on our attitude and perspective, or is it just automatic? In other words, is it possible to experience trials and actually be worse because of trials? What are your thoughts on that? Is it guaranteed that when you're a Christian and you go through a trial, you're going to be better at the end of it? No. And we've all known, right? We could probably write the names of folks we've known who've gone through trials as a Christian and actually come out worse for going through the trial because of the way they entered into the trial. So what makes the difference? Okay, the attitude. And notice he'll say, knowing, right? This is something that happens up here, knowing that this is the result of that. Art?
I think you hit on that, knowing.
Yeah.
The attitude up front, the attitude going in.
Right?
Is a big key.
It's
Try to blame God for whatever happens to them.
Yeah, it's exactly it. It's all about attitude.
Well, the attitude also is connected, I think, to maturity
Mm-hmm.
and grounding in
Yeah.
the faith. The more a person is grounded in the truth and faith, the more they are able to come through these things.
Yeah.
I've known Christians, like you said, that went through some things that came out worse.
Yeah.
And when I look at that situation, it's because they weren't grounded,
Yeah.
in the whole thing, and being mature, and they begin to look at it from a wrong point of view.
Yeah. It seems like, and it's not, it seems like sort of a catch-22. It's like, if you can just make it through this, you're going to be better for it. But when you're not mature, you think, well, how can I make it through? Because I need that maturity to help me make it through. Maybe that's where it comes back to the idea of brethren, because is there help in the church for people who don't have maturity, who are going through things? Where does that come from? From people with experience within the church, right? And that, we could chase a rabbit, but I think there's something to be said about in the church. We're going to talk about it tonight a little bit, but we don't always do the best job communicating with each other, right? We try to separate ourselves. We walk in and we're still separate a little bit, and then we walk out and we go back to our lives, and we don't really share our lives with each other, so none of us have any idea what's going on. But it's almost guaranteed, just based on the various trials that are out there, that if I've not gone through it, somebody else has. And I can draw from their experience, from their wisdom now, their patience where they lack nothing, and I can say, how did you make it through? What did you learn that can help me? And we don't do that as well as we need to do that. And I think that's part of the wisdom that he talks about in verse 5 and following. So he talks about, first of all, verse 3, he says, faith produces patience. Faith does that. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. And I guess in some way it's like a muscle, right? How does a muscle get stronger? It has to be exercised. And the exercising of that sometimes is pretty painful, right? If you're going to make it really strong, it gets painful sometimes. And patience here is like, maybe you have as a footnote endurance or steadfastness, perseverance, fortitude, heroic endurance, maybe something like that. And it's strengthened only by work. And that's the hard part, right? To go through that, to know that it's going to be strong as a result of that. And as we overcome trials, our faith grows as a result of that. It's just the going through it that's a really, really hard thing. But then he contrasts it in verse 4, and he says, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. And he's warning the readers, instead of cutting it short, which is our tendency, right? We want the escape button as soon as the trials come. He says, let patience run its course, meaning you go through the trial and you go to the very end of it for however long it is. But our tendency, of course, is to stop it short. But he explains why it is, because if you let patience have its perfect course, if you let it run its course, then you may be perfect or complete, lacking nothing. And this is a tough thing, right? Because in verse 4, when he says perfect and complete, sometimes those words mean exactly the same thing. Is he being redundant here, or these things mean something different? Tom, I see your hand up over there.
Well, I wasn't prepared to answer.
Yeah, go ahead. Whatever you're going to say.
I was going to make a comment. I know we're basically talking about spiritual trials here.
Yes.
However, there are an awful lot of people, so-called experts, who say we're going into a deep recession and maybe into depression.
Yeah, that's included within this.
It is included in this. And Arthur was talking about being prepared for it. Well, I would hope we are, but none of us really are. The thing about it is, we have to understand that God will take care of us.
Sure.
As long as we do our best to take care of
That's right.
ourselves. But it does seem like it's coming, and
Sure.
and these problems we're going to endure are going to spill over from the physical to the spiritual if we're not careful.
Yeah, we do our very best to avoid hard times, but I think we're being told here, hard times aren't the worst thing to ever happen to Christians. I mean, if you look at the first century, and someone kind of made allusion to some of the things early in Christianity, I think Steve was kind of mentioning some of that. But I mean, if you read what happens in the first, 10 or so chapters of the book of Acts, were times pretty tough for Christians back then? What about financially? Were they pretty bad back then? And yet what happened to the church? It exploded. It went everywhere. Because when all the physical and material things were stripped away, it was you either did what was right spiritually or you just went back out into the world. And so I don't know that it's the worst thing in the whole wide world to happen.
I've mentioned this before, but an example of this is what's happening in Ukraine.
Yes.
I think one thing, of course, people turn to God often automatically when things go bad. And I think the other thing is they are seeing the faithfulness of Christians. To me, I'm amazed by their faithfulness. People who easily miss services and so forth.
Right.
These people
Sure.
And yet there are baptisms going on, and they're sharing what they have with the community. And there are good things going on there in the midst of all the harm.
I mean, if the Lord came back or they died, is there a better place to be than in the assembly? You know, if that happens, I don't know. I think sometimes our attitude is not quite there, and it needs to be.
Well, there's also Christians in Poland who are accepting these folks that are,
Yeah.
that are helping them out.
Yeah.
Just doing exactly what God wanted them to do
Exactly.
from that
Yeah.
standpoint. They're there that can help, just like we can help
Yeah.
people at times.
Yeah. One person's trials can sometimes lead to another person's trials, so there's different sets. He does mention here that if we were to handle those things correctly, the end of that would be that we would be perfect and complete, or mature and without blemish, meaning that the way you live and the end result kind of go hand in hand, because living right and maturity go hand in hand. That kind of gets back to what Tommy was saying. You just got to do the right thing, and you become more seasoned along the way as you do that. I can't grow without living right, and without living right, we can't handle trials correctly, and the result is we end up lacking nothing, or nothing is left behind. In other words, we're not going to miss out on any part of spiritual growth if we handle those trials correctly. But as you mentioned, it all depends on attitude, because they can kind of make or break us. I mean, these things are make or break, right? Was it somebody had the expression, I forgot who did it a long time ago, they said, attitudes determine altitudes. And I think that's true here. You know, attitude makes all the difference in how we handle it. So this brings us to number 3, right? So this gets us into the discussion about wisdom. Number 3, in a similar sense, is wisdom automatic, or are there conditions placed upon it? And just how important is faith to the growth of a Christian? Talk about wisdom. Right? Is that just automatic, or is it conditioned? What's one of the conditions placed upon wisdom? You got to ask for it. What is wisdom exactly?
The ability to apply knowledge.
Okay.
In the appropriate way.
So it's a little, it includes knowledge, but it's different than the definition of knowledge, right? Because knowledge is, well, how would you define knowledge?
You know something.
Yeah, okay. It's just possessing a fact. It's knowing a fact. But there's a difference between knowing a fact and knowing how to use that fact. And that's wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to apply what we've learned. All right? So there's a difference between just possession of facts or knowing what is right and in knowing how to apply what is right. That's why a lot of people refer to wisdom as experienced knowledge, right? It's knowledge that's been put to the test over the years. And if we are lacking that, which is, by the way, it's necessary to get through a trial, we have to ask God for it. And you know what? We mentioned last week, a lot of people consider the book of James like a mini Sermon on the Mount, and it's hard not to see this in relation to when Jesus said, ask and seek and knock, and it's kind of the same thing here. If you are in need of something, you ask for it, and God supplies it. In fact, the Bible says God gives it liberally or freely. Generously, He does that. So when we ask for wisdom, is God angry that we ask Him for that? Oh, He's happy. He gladly gives us what we need. Now, the question is, how does He give that, okay? Was there in the first century such a thing as miraculous wisdom? Yeah, in 1 Corinthians 12, one of the miraculous gifts was wisdom, okay? And he gave them miraculous discernment, and that was needed in the absence of a written word. We've got the word now. Today, it's when we know the Bible and we're able to apply that Bible knowledge with experience. And I think, and I'm convinced of it, that the application today would be, if we ask for it, God can certainly arrange the circumstances in His great providence to allow us to do this. And so I've always jokingly said to myself and within our family, I said, if you pray for patience, you better buckle your seatbelt, because God will sure provide the circumstance for you to do that. And so when in the morning, you get up and you say, God, help me to develop patience, and an hour later, you're stuck in a 3-hour line of traffic going through Chattanooga. Well, He gave you the answer to it, didn't He? You just have to be happy, which we're not, because we don't count that all joy. You've got to be able to do that to know that there's something better waiting for us on the other side. But He conditions that. He said, don't you dare doubt when you do it. Art?
No, we talk about asking for wisdom, and yet that book we've got,
Yes.
right there,
Oh, yes.
And I've marveled, I wish somebody told me when I was younger to read and study the book of Proverbs more.
Sure.
Because I've never found a book on management or a training class on management or anything I've been through all my life that was any better and didn't even measure up to the book of Proverbs.
That's right. Yeah, just one or two statements on debt or how to handle money or how to use your words correctly or how to be a good friend. All that's in Proverbs. So, yeah, the wisdom is there. We just have to have the courage to apply it in real life to know that it works. But you're right about that. There's a condition placed upon this, though. If you ask God for wisdom, what's the condition?
Ask in faith.
You better do it in faith. Because does it work if it's faithless? It won't work. I heard one preacher say one time when he was a little boy, he used to pray, his literal prayer to God was, God, please give me a BB gun, but I know you're not going to give it to me. Well, I mean, he really prayed for that. Well, we do that sometimes, right? We say it because we know we should say it. We're just not asking in faith. And if we say, God, I need wisdom, then be prepared for how he's going to grant the wisdom. We have to ask in faith. And he gives us some illustrations here. He says, verse 6, he says, you've got to ask in faith, but you can't do it doubting, right? Doubting is like you're unsettled in your mind. It's like you're asking, but you're really not quite there. And he says, it's like the wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. What does a wave do? Crashes against the shore, and then what's it do? It pulls back, right? There's the ebb and the flow of the wave. And he says a lot of people are like that because they're asking, but they're not really intent on the purpose of their prayer. And then he says in verse 7, that man's not going to get anything from the Lord that he's asked. And then in verse 8, he says the double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And the actual word picture here is of a drunken person who's kind of wavering side to side down the street. And he said a faithless person who's pretending to ask these things in faith is kind of like a drunk man going from side to side. There's no stability in his ways, and he's not going to receive what he needs from the Lord. Any thoughts on that before we move to the next section? Okay. Number 4. This has been a tough section for a lot of folks. I think it goes with what he's talking about. And question number 4 is, do you think that poverty and wealth, those two stations, are they harmless, or are there dangers in each of those positions? And in what way do they test a Christian life? And I think when he's talking about you're going to go through various trials, poverty and wealth are part of the trials that people can go through, so they kind of go with that. He talks about the brother of low degree, and then he talks about, in verse 10, the rich man. So he has both of these things in the balance. Are poverty and wealth harmless, or could there be dangers in each of those things? Yeah, Steve?
I thought of this a few minutes ago when we were talking, but it's about some comments that people have observed society over different generations. Those that went through like World War I and II knew what it was here in the United States, that people had to do without things,
Yeah.
and how their children were raised to work hard for
Yes.
what they wanted. But yet, the next generation come along and had everything.
And
had
didn't
all
work as
the
hard.
issues.
Yeah. Yeah, what is it? Hard times build strong men build something, and then if you look at generationally, it eventually ends up with weak people being built, and then you have to go through the whole thing over again. I can remember very well, my grandmother, Mom's mom, never threw anything away. If it was in the cupboard, she ate it, every drop of everything that was in the cupboard, because she lived through a time when they had nothing. And she was very resourceful, and she managed things well because she came through that. And I think that's just the thing. Tough times build strong people. That's what James is talking about. You can't live in affluence and have everything and be wasteful and have everything at your disposal without that infecting you in some way to make you kind of soft. And James is talking about spiritually, things that are tough make you tougher. All right. Yeah, Terry?
Well, in its simplicity to say phrase, that the poor man is concerned with his next meal,
Yes.
the rich man is concerned with the last meal.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Is there a danger in being poor? Spiritually speaking, is there a temptation or a trial in that? What would be the trial?
Sometimes you blame God for your
Yeah, sometimes you blame God for that. Look at Proverbs 30. I think this is a great companion passage. Proverbs chapter 30. Since Art mentioned Proverbs, let's just go back and note one of these. Proverbs chapter 30. Spiritually speaking, there's nothing wrong with being poor. Spiritually speaking, there's nothing wrong with having money. There's just not. But there are trials in each of those positions. Proverbs chapter 30, and let's look at verse 8 and 9. Just thinking off the top of my head here. Remove falsehood and lies from me. Okay, so now he's going to get to poverty and riches. Give me neither poverty nor riches. I don't want to be rich or poor, right? Feed me with the food that is allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you. So what happens sometimes in fullness or riches? A lot of times people think, look what I've done. I don't even need God anymore. You want a great example? Luke 12. And there's a guy there in parable where Jesus says, he says, you know what? I've done well for myself. I'm going to build greater barns than I've got. And he tears them down and he never thinks about God. And that happens sometimes in riches. And say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and do what? Oh, and steal and profane the name of my God. So God gets the blame, and sometimes we think, well, the rich have what they have and they don't really need it, so I could take it from them. And so there's trial in each of these things. And I think that's why James includes that as a part of this. And maybe it goes back to a little bit what Steve was talking about earlier, because if you put this in a Jewish context, in a Jewish community, you had probably very, very, very wealthy people, and then there was no middle ground, and then you had extremely poor people, and it presented some temptation for those folks. And so look in James chapter 1, look at some of the language. First of all, he talks about in verse 9, the lowly brother. And the lowly brother here it literally means he hasn't risen off the ground very far, right? Socially, economically, he's just... He hasn't come a long way up the ladder. And on the other side, you've got the rich man. And yet, notice in verse 9, the lowly brother is told to glory in his exaltation. There's a trial. What's he supposed to do? Count it all joy. That's what he's supposed to do. And in verse 10, he says, but the rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field, he will pass away. And so he's supposed to handle the trial correctly, knowing that his riches could do what at any moment? Like a flower of the grass, they could just be gone. And it happens, right? And I'm going to quote somebody who framed this better than I could ever frame this. I just think the way he described this is so much better than the way I could. He said, the very same treatment that exalts the poor man and gives him a new sense of worth also humbles the rich man. Why? Suffering shows him that instead of having a lasting lease on life, his life on this earth is no more permanent than a wild flower. Suffering and persecution reveal how tentative and short life really is. And the rich and the poor both have to deal with that in different ways, and I think that goes with that. Okay, next week is a little different. Next week we're talking about sin, right? Just an absolute temptation to do the wrong thing. And just like temptations are trials generally in life, temptation can be hard to resist sometimes because it seems so catered to us. It's like that little delicious morsel that you can't resist it. And there's some language in there that helps us to understand that. So get a copy of the new notes if you've not, and take that home and do some research on that, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on how temptation works, but how God doesn't get the blame for that. So let's talk about that next week. Thank you so much for a great discussion today. Really good. Appreciate it.